You do not belong here, Mayam, and I'm going to make sure you miss that flight." The officer's voice cut through the noise of the airport like a blade, sharp and certain, loud enough for nearby passengers to turn and stare. Naomi Carter stood still at the security checkpoint, her carry-on bag resting quietly beside her feet, her hands visible, her posture calm. Around her, rolling suitcases slowed, conversations faded, and the steady rhythm of announcements overhead seemed to dull under the weight of the moment. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped closer, his uniform crisp, his expression tighter than necessary, his eyes scanning her not as a traveler, but as a problem. He took her identification without asking twice, flipping it open with a dismissive flick, as if the answer had already been decided before the question was ever asked. Naomi did not reach for it. She did not argue. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, unreadable, almost patient, as if this moment was not unexpected but inevitable. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The line behind Naomi began to grow, whispers spreading like ripples across water, people leaning just enough to catch a better look without stepping in. Daniel's voice rose again, louder this time, each word carrying the weight of authority he believed could not be challenged. He questioned her ticket, her destination, her reason for traveling, even though everything sat clearly printed in his hand. Naomi answered only when necessary, her voice soft but firm, never defensive, never raised. That calm seemed to irritate him more than resistance ever could. He circled slightly, positioning himself between her and the metal detector, blocking her path in a way that felt deliberate. A nearby agent glanced over, hesitated, then quickly looked away. The overhead lights cast a pale glow across the polished floor, reflecting the stillness of Naomi's stance against the restless movement of everyone else. She adjusted her sleeve slowly, almost absent-mindedly, then glanced toward the digital clock above the gate entrance, her eyes lingering there for just a second longer than normal. Daniel noticed. His jaw tightened. "You think this is a game," he said under his breath, stepping closer, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. Naomi did not respond right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with controlled precision, as if she had practiced this moment 100 times before. Around them, the airport continued to move, but the space between them felt frozen, suspended in a quiet tension that no one else dared to break. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, Naomi finally spoke, not to argue, not to defend herself, but as if stating something already decided. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her tone even, her eyes locked onto his, holding a calm that did not belong to someone who had just been stopped, but to someone who understood exactly what was about to happen next. Daniel Brooks did not like the way she said that. Not the words themselves, but the calm behind them, the absence of fear that usually came when people realized they were about to miss a flight, the kind of calm that did not match the situation standing in front of him. And for a brief moment, something in his expression flickered before hardening again into the authority he was used to wearing like armor every single day. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, controlled, deliberate, as if he was no longer speaking to a traveler, but to someone he had already decided needed to be put in place. "You do not get to question me here," he said, each word slow, measured, meant to press down rather than explode outward. And then he turned slightly, raising his hand to signal another officer nearby, a younger man who hesitated for a second before stepping closer, uncertainty visible in the way his eyes moved between Daniel and Naomi. "We are moving her too." "Secondary screening," Daniel announced, louder now, making sure the surrounding crowd could hear, making sure there was no confusion about who was in control. Naomi did not resist as he reached for her bag, did not pull away when he gestured for her to step aside. She simply picked up the handle of her carry-on and followed the direction of his hand, her movements steady, almost deliberate, as if she had already accepted where this path was leading long before he ever stopped her. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoed softly as they walked, the noise of the main checkpoint fading behind them, replaced by a quieter tension that lived in the narrow corridor leading to the screening area. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow that flattened everything into shades of gray. The younger officer glanced at Naomi again, his brow tightening slightly as if trying to place her, but Daniel's presence kept him silent, kept him from asking the question that seemed to sit just behind his lips. Inside the screening room, the air felt different, heavier, like a space where decisions were made without witnesses. Daniel placed her bag on the metal table with a sharper motion than necessary, the sound echoing off the walls. "Empty your pockets," he ordered, not looking at her face this time, as if eye contact was no longer required. Naomi complied without hesitation, placing her phone, her wallet, and a small leather folder neatly on the table. Her hands never shaking, her breathing never changing, and that calm, that stillness. It started to work under Daniel's skin in a way he could not quite explain. Because people in this room were supposed to react, they were supposed to defend themselves, to argue, to show something that confirmed his suspicion, but she gave him nothing, and nothing was harder to control than something that refused to push back. He opened the folder without asking, flipping through its contents quickly, too quickly, as if speed could replace certainty. Pages moved under his fingers, official. Looking documents, printed text, signatures, but he did not pause long enough to actually read. Not really, because he had already made up his mind about what he was looking for. "Where are you headed?" he asked again, sharper this time, and Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his. That same steady gaze, unbroken. "Washington," she said, her voice even. "I have a meeting." Daniel let out a short breath, something between a scoff and a laugh. "Of course you do," he muttered, closing the folder and setting it aside without care. The younger officer shifted his weight, glancing at the folder, then back at Naomi, and this time the hesitation lasted a little longer, long enough to be noticed. Daniel caught it, his head turning slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Problem?" he asked, the single word carrying more pressure than volume. The younger officer shook his head quickly, stepping back. "No, sir." And that was all it took. The moment gone, the doubt buried. Daniel turned back to Naomi, stepping closer again, closing the space between them. "Here's what is going to happen," he said, his tone final, controlled. "You're going to stay right here until I figure out exactly what you are doing, because something about this does not add up." Naomi looked at him for a long second, not angry, not afraid, just present, as if she was measuring something invisible. And then her gaze shifted, not to the door, not to the table, but to the small camera mounted high in the corner of the room, its red light steady, recording everything. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow heavier, carrying a quiet certainty that did not need volume to be heard. "It already adds up," she said. And for the first time since this started, Daniel felt something he did not recognize settle in his chest. Not doubt, not yet, but something close enough to make him tighten his grip on control just a little bit. More. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Not because the walls were closing in, but because the silence inside it had begun to press down on everything, heavy and deliberate, the kind of silence that made even the faint hum of the overhead lights feel loud. Daniel Brooks stood rigid near the table, his hand resting close to the folder he had already dismissed, his eyes fixed on Naomi Carter as if staring long enough might force her to reveal something she had not yet said. But Naomi did not move. She did not shift or wait or glance away. She simply stood there with that same steady presence, her gaze calm, her breathing even, and it was that stillness that unsettled the rhythm he was used to controlling, because this was not how these moments usually went. There was always resistance or fear or frustration, something to push against, something to justify the authority he carried. But here there was nothing, and nothing had a way of exposing everything. The younger officer, near the door, cleared his throat softly, the sound almost swallowed by the tension, his eyes flicking once more toward the folder on the table, then back to Naomi, as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he expected. Daniel noticed again, and this time his patience thinned. "Focus on your job," he said without turning his head, his voice low but edged with warning. The younger officer straightened immediately, nodding, stepping back into silence. Naomi's eyes moved again, not hurried, not nervous, just aware, taking in the room with a quiet precision that suggested she was not simply present but observing, calculating, remembering. Her gaze passed over the door, the table, the officers, and then settled once more on Daniel. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm weight as before. "Already made your decision before you opened that folder," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact that hung in the air between them. Daniel let out a short breath, sharper this time, his control tightening around the edges. "What I decide is based on what I see," he replied, his tone firm. But there was a slight shift now, something defensive threading through his words. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not in challenge but in acknowledgement. "That is exactly the problem," she said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any argument could have. For a brief moment the room seemed to pause, the hum of the lights, the faint echo of distant footsteps outside, all of it fading under the weight of what had just been said. Daniel stepped forward, closing the distance again, his presence more forceful now, as if proximity could reassert control. "You think you are in a position to lecture me," he said, his voice lower, tighter. "You are being held for additional screening, nothing more. And if everything checks out, then you will be free to go." Naomi did not flinch at the shift in tone, did not mirror his intensity. Instead, she reached slowly for the edge of the table, her fingers resting lightly against the cool metal surface, grounding herself in a way that seemed intentional. Her eyes flicked once more toward the camera in the corner, that steady red light still watching, still recording. And then she looked back at him. "Everything is already checked," she said, her voice softer now, almost quiet, but carrying a certainty that cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. The younger officer shifted again, this time unable to hide it completely, his gaze moving quickly between them, something unspoken building behind his eyes. Daniel caught it, and this time the irritation was immediate, visible in the tightening of his jaw. "If you have something to say, then say it," he snapped toward the younger officer, who hesitated, then shook his head again. But the hesitation had lasted too long. It had already said enough. Daniel turned back to Naomi, but something had changed, subtle but undeniable. The absolute certainty he carried at the start of this interaction had developed a small fracture, barely visible, but present, and Naomi saw it. Not in his words, but in the way his eyes held just a fraction longer before narrowing again. And for the first time, there was a shift in her expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if the moment she had been waiting for had just begun to unfold. She straightened slightly, her posture unchanged, but her presence somehow sharper, more defined. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet finality. "You still have time to stop this," she said. And this time the words did not sound like a suggestion. They sounded like a line that once crossed could not be undone. And Daniel, standing there in that controlled silence, felt that same unfamiliar weight settle deeper. Not yet fear, but something that no longer felt entirely within his control. Daniel Brooks did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for the faint hum of the ventilation system to creep back into awareness. Long enough for the younger officer near the door to shift his stance again. Uncertain, watching, waiting for direction that did not come as quickly as it should have. Daniel's eyes stayed locked on Naomi Carter, but there was something different now. Not weakness, not hesitation he would ever admit, but a recalculation, as if he was trying to regain control of a situation that no longer followed the familiar script he had relied on for years. He reached for the folder again, this time opening it slower, his fingers no longer flipping through the pages with careless speed, but pausing, scanning, actually reading, the printed lines, the official formatting, the signatures that he had ignored before now sitting heavier under his gaze. Naomi did not move. She did not speak. She allowed the silence to work, allowed him to sit inside the decision he had already made. Outside in the main terminal, the distant echo of an announcement filtered faintly through the walls. A boarding call for a flight that Naomi was supposed to be on, the timing not lost on her, but clearly slipping past him. The younger officer leaned slightly, his eyes catching a glimpse of the document in Daniel's hands. And this time his reaction was not just hesitation. It was recognition, subtle but sharp. his posture stiffening just enough to betray it before he forced himself. Still again, Daniel noticed the movement, his head turning quickly. "What is it?" he asked, his tone sharper now, edged with something that sounded closer to demand than authority. The younger officer hesitated, his voice lower when he spoke. "Careful. Measured, sir, that looks like a federal clearance document," he said, choosing each word with caution, as if aware that saying too much could cost him more than silence ever would. Daniel's grip on the folder tightened slightly, his jaw setting. As he glanced back down, scanning again, slower this time. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Naomi watched, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in her eyes, as if she was watching a line being crossed in real time, one that could not be stepped back from once it was fully understood. Daniel closed the folder again, more controlled this time, placing it back on the table with deliberate precision. "Anyone can carry papers," he said, his voice firm but no longer as absolute as before. "That does not mean anything without verification." It sounded like control, but it felt like justification, the kind people reach for when certainty begins to slip. Naomi finally moved just slightly, her hand reaching toward the edge of the table again. Not to take anything, not to defend herself, but simply to exist within the space without shrinking. Her voice when she spoke was calm, steady, almost quiet, but it carried a weight that settled into the room like something inevitable. "Already know it is real," she said, not as a challenge, but as a statement, and that was what made it harder to ignore. Daniel took a step closer again, but this time the movement lacked the same confidence it had carried before. There was a fraction of pause in it, a moment where he seemed to measure his own. "Next action. What I know is that you are being held until I clear this," he replied, his tone tightening as if trying to rebuild the authority that had begun to fracture. Naomi's eyes did not leave his, and for the first time there was a slight shift in her expression, not emotion, but clarity, as if the moment had finally aligned with something she had anticipated all along. She reached slowly toward her phone on the table, not grabbing it, not rushing, simply placing her hand near it, her fingers resting lightly beside it. Waiting, the younger officer noticed immediately, his attention snapping to the movement. But he did not step in. He did not speak. Something held him back, something unspoken but understood. Daniel followed her gaze down to the phone, then back up to her face, his eyes narrowing again. "You are not making any calls right now," he said quickly, the response almost immediate, as if instinct had taken over where certainty had begun to fail. Naomi did not pull her hand away, did not react to the restriction. She simply let the silence sit between them for a moment longer. And then she spoke, her voice softer than before, but more certain than anything she had said yet. "Then you should call someone," she said, her tone even, controlled, "because this does not stop here." The words did not rise, they did not demand attention, but they landed with a finality that shifted the air in the room. The younger officer's eyes moved again, this time not just uncertain, but concerned. And Daniel, standing there with the folder still within reach and the camera still recording above them, felt that unfamiliar pressure deepen. No longer just a fracture in his certainty, but the beginning of something he could not fully control. And for the first time since this started, the room no longer felt like a place where he decided what happened next. Daniel Brooks felt the shift before he fully understood it. The kind of shift that did not come from noise or movement, but from something quieter, something internal, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air grows heavy and still. Naomi Carter's words did not echo, but they stayed, lingering in the space between them, pressing against the edges of his certainty. He glanced once more at the phone resting on the table, then at the folder beside it, and for a brief second his eyes moved toward the door, as if considering something he had not planned to consider before. But the moment passed, replaced quickly by the instinct that had carried him through years of decisions made without question. He straightened slightly, drawing in a controlled breath. "You are not in a position to tell me what to do," he said, his voice firm again, louder now, as if reclaiming volume could restore authority. And, without waiting for a response, he reached for his radio, bringing it up to his shoulder, pressing the button with more force than necessary. "I need verification on a possible fraudulent federal document," he said into it, each word clipped, deliberate, making sure the narrative stayed within his control. The younger officer's eyes widened slightly at the wording, his gaze snapping toward Naomi, then back to Daniel. But he said nothing, the silence between them growing thicker. Naomi did not react to the accusation, did not protest or defend herself. She simply watched, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, and that lack of reaction only deepened the tension, because it removed the resistance that usually justified escalation. The radio crackled softly, a distant voice responding, asking for details. Daniel lowered the device slightly, glancing at the folder again, flipping it open with a sharper motion this time, reading out fragments, names, numbers spelled out carefully, each detail sounding more official the longer he spoke. And with every word something subtle began to shift in the room, the younger officer's expression tightening, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition turned into concern. Naomi's gaze remained fixed on Daniel. But there was something new there now. Not patience alone, but inevitability, as if the moment he had just set in motion was exactly the one she had been waiting for. The radio responded again, the voice on the other end quieter. This time, slower, asking him to repeat a specific line. Daniel did, his tone still controlled but no longer as effortless. And then there was a pause, longer than before, long enough for the faint sounds of the airport beyond the walls to creep back in. Rolling luggage, distant announcements, the hum of movement continuing somewhere outside this room. The younger officer shifted again, unable to hide it now, his eyes flicking toward the radio, then toward Naomi, and back again. Daniel pressed the button once more. "Do you copy?" he asked, his voice sharper, and when the response came it was different, not loud, not urgent, but weighted, deliberate. "Stand by," the voice said, and then the line went quiet. Daniel lowered the radio slowly, his jaw tightening, his grip lingering on the device for a moment longer than necessary. Naomi exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders rising and falling with that same controlled rhythm. And then she spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a certainty that filled the silence left by the radio. "That was your first call," she said, not accusing, not mocking, simply marking the moment. Daniel's eyes snapped back to hers, irritation flashing quickly. "This is standard procedure," he replied, but the words felt thinner now, less grounded than before. Naomi nodded once, a small, almost respectful gesture. "Of course it is," she said, and for a second there was something in her tone that sounded almost like understanding, but did not comfort. It unsettled, because it suggested she had seen this pattern before, understood it, expected it. The younger officer took a small step forward, hesitating before speaking. "Sir, maybe we should escalate this up the chain," he said carefully, his voice low, cautious. Daniel turned toward him immediately, the sharpness returning. "I am handling it," he said, the words quick, firm, cutting off any further suggestion, but even as he said it, the certainty behind them was no longer absolute. Naomi watched the exchange quietly, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, but the room around her felt different now, less like a place where she was being held, and more like a place where something was beginning to unravel. The camera in the corner continued to record, its small red light unwavering, capturing every word, every shift, every moment where control slipped just a fraction further, and Naomi, standing therein, that controlled stillness, knew that the line had already been crossed. Not when he stopped her, not when he brought her into this room, but the moment he chose to make that call, because now the system had been invited in, and once it entered, it would not leave without changing everything. The silence that followed the radio response did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something unseen had just entered the room, and was now standing quietly between them. Watching, waiting, Daniel Brooks lowered his hand slowly from the radio, but his grip did not loosen. His fingers remained tense around the device, as if letting go would mean surrendering something he could not yet name. The younger officer near the door shifted again, this time stepping just slightly closer to the table, drawn not by authority, but by the weight of what had just been set in motion. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but there was a subtle shift in the air around her, not visible, not spoken, but undeniable, like the moment before a verdict is delivered when everyone already knows the outcome, but no one has said it yet. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, the sound more for himself than anyone else. And then he moved, not toward Naomi but toward the table, opening the folder again. This time with deliberate care, his eyes scanning line by line, slower than before. Absorbing details he had previously dismissed, titles, authorizations, identifiers written out in full, each one carrying a weight that grew heavier the longer he looked. The younger officer leaned slightly, unable to hold back now, his voice low but urgent. "Sir, we should not be handling this alone," he said, the words careful but firm. Daniel did not look up immediately, his eyes still locked on the page, as if searching for something that would restore the certainty he had lost. "I said I am handling it," he replied, but the tone had changed again, less commanding, more strained, as if the words were being pushed out rather than standing on their own. Naomi watched quietly, her gaze moving once more to the camera in the corner, that small red light still steady, still recording, and then back to Daniel, her eyes calm, patient, almost waiting, and in that stillness there was something powerful, something that did not need to speak to be understood. Daniel closed the folder slowly, this time placing it down with controlled precision, but his hand lingered on it, his fingers pressing lightly against the cover, as if grounding himself in something tangible. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, sudden, sharp, cutting through the heavy quiet. Both officers turned toward it instantly. Daniel raised it, pressing the button without hesitation. "This is Officer Brooks," he said, his voice tight, focused, and the response came immediately. No delay this time, no static, just a voice that carried a different kind of authority, calm, controlled, and unmistakably higher in the chain. "Do not proceed further," the voice said, each word clear, deliberate. "Maintain current position and wait for supervisory contact." Daniel's expression shifted, subtle but visible, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to process what he had just heard. "I have the situation under control," he responded quickly, instinctively, but the reply that came back did not match his tone. "Negative," the voice said, firmer now, leaving no room for interpretation. "Do not proceed." The line went silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, final. Daniel lowered the radio slowly, his grip tightening once more, his eyes moving back to Naomi, searching, measuring, and for the first time there was something unmistakable there, not authority, not certainty, but doubt, real and present. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet confirmation in her eyes, as if everything unfolding had already been accounted for long before he ever reached for that radio. The younger officer stepped forward now, no longer able to remain passive. "Sir," he said softly, but with a firmness that had not been there before, "we should wait." Daniel did not respond immediately, the weight of the room pressing down on him from all sides, the camera watching, the folder on the table, the radio silent in his hand, and Naomi standing there, calm, unmoved, unaffected by the shift that was now impossible to ignore, seconds stretched, long enough to feel like something was breaking apart piece by piece. And then Naomi spoke again, her voice low, steady, carrying a quiet finality that settled over everything. "You were told to stop," she said, not as a command, not as a challenge, but as a simple truth, and in that moment the control Daniel had held so tightly from the beginning no longer felt like control at all. It felt like something slipping, something he could not fully grasp anymore, and the room that once belonged to him now felt like a place where the next move was no longer his to decide. The words settled into the room like a weight that could not be lifted, not by denial, not by authority, not even by time. Daniel Brooks stood still for a moment longer than he intended, the radio still in his hand, the echo of the command repeating quietly in his mind, "Do not proceed," and yet everything in him resisted that instruction. Not because he did not understand it, but because accepting it meant acknowledging that he was no longer the one in control. His grip tightened once more before he finally lowered the radio to his side, his shoulders squaring again as if posture alone could restore the balance that had shifted. "We are not done here," he said, his voice steady but carrying a tension that had not been there before. Naomi Carter did not react. She did not argue or push back. She simply watched him with that same calm presence that had followed every moment of this encounter, and that calm now felt heavier, more defined, as if it had been waiting for this exact point to fully reveal itself. The younger officer near the door hesitated again, his eyes moving. Between them, uncertainty now replaced with something closer to concern. "Sir, they told us to hold," he said carefully, but there was more weight in his voice this time, less fear of speaking and more awareness of the consequences of staying silent. Daniel turned sharply, the frustration surfacing quickly. "I heard what they said," he replied, his tone sharper than before, but not louder, not as controlled. "And I will decide what that means here." The statement hung in the air, but it no longer carried the same unquestioned authority it once had. Naomi's gaze shifted slightly, not away from him but through him, as if seeing beyond the moment, beyond the room, into something he could not yet see himself. She took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with measured control, and then she spoke again, her voice even, quiet, but cutting through the tension with clarity. "You are trying to hold on to something that is already gone," she said, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a simple certainty that made the words land deeper than any raised voice could have. Daniel stepped forward again, closing the distance between them, his presence more forceful now, as if proximity could reassert dominance. But the movement lacked the confidence it once carried. There was a fraction of hesitation in it. A moment where he seemed to question the step even as he took it. "You do not get to define this situation," he said, his voice low, tight, each word pressed out with effort. Naomi did not move back, did not yield space. She stood exactly where she was, meeting his gaze without resistance, without fear, and that stillness created a contrast that made his movement feel heavier, less certain. The room around them seemed to narrow, the walls, the table, the camera in the corner, all of it fading into the background as the tension centered on the space between them. The younger officer shifted again, this time stepping slightly closer, no longer willing to remain at the edge, his voice quieter but firmer than before. "Sir, if this is what it looks like, then we need to stop," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in the statement, only concern, real and immediate. Daniel did not respond right away, his eyes still locked on Naomi, searching for something, anything that would restore the certainty he had lost. But she gave him nothing except the truth of the moment reflected back at him. Calm, steady, undeniable. Seconds passed, long enough for the weight of the situation to settle fully, long enough for the illusion of control to crack further. And then Naomi spoke again, her voice softer than before, but carrying a finality that felt absolute. "This was never your decision to make," she said. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The line had already been crossed. The system had already begun to move beyond this room, beyond him. And Daniel, standing there with the radio silent at his side and the folder still resting on the table, felt the shift completely, not just in the room, but within himself, the realization that whatever happened next would not be determined by the authority he had relied on, but by something far larger, something already in motion. And for the first time since this began, he was no longer leading the situation. He was standing inside it, waiting, whether he chose to admit it or not, for what was about to come next. The air in the room no longer felt still. It felt charged, as if something invisible had begun to move through it, something larger than the three people standing inside those walls. Daniel Brooks stood frozen in place for a fraction of a second after Naomi Carter's words, his mind trying to catch up to a situation that no longer followed the rules he had relied on. His eyes flicked briefly toward the radio at his side, then toward the door, then back to Naomi, searching for control in a space that no longer responded to him the way it had just minutes before. The younger officer took another step forward, closer now than he had ever been, his posture no longer passive, his voice low but firm. "Sir, we need to pause this," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a recognition of what was already happening. Daniel did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening, his breath slower now, heavier, as if each second required more effort than the last. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, grounded, unaffected by the shift that had begun to unravel the authority in front of her. She glanced once more toward the camera in the corner, the small red light, still steady, capturing everything, and then her eyes moved back to Daniel. And in that look there was no challenge, no emotion, only clarity, the kind that comes from knowing the outcome before it arrives. A faint sound echoed from beyond the door, distant at first, almost easy to ignore, but it grew slightly louder with each passing second. Footsteps, measured, coordinated, not rushed but purposeful. The kind of movement that did not belong to confusion or panic, but to direction, to command. The younger officer heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the door, his expression shifting from concern to something sharper. Awareness. Daniel remained facing Naomi, but his attention split, part of him still locked in the moment, part of him reaching toward that sound, toward what it might mean. The footsteps drew closer, steady, controlled, and then there was a pause just outside the door, a silence that felt deliberate, like the moment before a decision is made visible. Daniel's hand moved. Slightly, not reaching for anything, just reacting, instinct searching for something familiar, something to hold on to. Naomi exhaled softly, her shoulders rising and falling once more with that same measured calm. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying a certainty that matched the sound outside the room. "This is where it changes," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had already begun. The younger officer swallowed subtly, his eyes fixed on the door now, his body angled slightly, as if preparing for something he could not yet see. Daniel's expression hardened again, but this time it felt different, less like control and more like resistance. The door handle moved, slow, deliberate, the faint sound of metal shifting, breaking the tension in a way that could not be undone. And then the door opened, not abruptly, not with force, but with a controlled motion that revealed two figures standing just outside, their presence immediately changing the balance of the room. Their posture straight, their expressions neutral but firm, the kind of authority that did not need to be announced because it was already understood. The younger officer stepped back instinctively, his shoulders straightening, his gaze lowering slightly in recognition. Daniel turned fully now, facing them, his body still squared, but his stance no longer as certain. One of the figures stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly, his voice calm, measured, leaving no room for interpretation. "Officer Brooks," he said, and the use of his name alone carried more weight than any command that had come before. "Step away from the subject." The words were not loud, but they landed with a finality that settled into the room like something irreversible. Daniel did not move immediately, his eyes flicking once toward Naomi, then back to the figure in the doorway, the tension inside him pulling in two directions at once, the instinct to hold control and the recognition that it had already slipped beyond him. Naomi stood silent, watching, her expression unchanged, but in her stillness there was a quiet confirmation, as if everything unfolding had already been accounted for long before this moment arrived. And, as the seconds stretched, with the door open and the authority now standing inside the room, it became clear that whatever came next was no longer a possibility. It was a consequence already in motion. Daniel Brooks did not move, not at first. Even as the words settled around him, "Step away from the subject," the command was clear, direct, and carried a level of authority that did not need repetition. But something inside him resisted, not out of confidence anymore, but out of habit, the kind of habit built over years of being the one who gave orders, not the one who followed them in moments like this. His eyes shifted once more toward Naomi Carter, searching for something that could anchor him back to the version of control he had started with. But she stood exactly as she had been, calm, composed, untouched by the tension that now filled the room. The figure in the doorway took another step forward, his presence firm, grounded, the kind of presence that changed a space simply by entering. That was not a suggestion, he said, his voice still even, still controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now, one that made the meaning unmistakable. The younger officer stepped back further, instinctively clearing space, his posture straight, his attention fixed on the exchange. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than before, and then finally he stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough. Enough to shift the balance completely, enough to acknowledge what had already been. Decided, the figure in the doorway nodded slightly, not in approval, but in recognition. And then his attention moved past Daniel, directly to Naomi, his posture adjusting subtly, not less authoritative but different, respectful. "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, professional, carrying a weight that contrasted sharply with everything that had come before. Naomi inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement. Her expression unchanged, but her presence now clearly defined in a way that no one in the room could ignore anymore. The second figure stepped in behind the first, his eyes scanning the room quickly, taking in the table, the folder, the camera, the officers, everything. His gaze paused briefly on Daniel, not lingering, but noting, as if marking a detail that would not be forgotten. Daniel's hands dropped slightly at his sides, the radio no longer held with the same tension. His posture still upright, but no longer commanding. The shift was subtle, but complete. The figure nearest Naomi spoke again. "We are going to resolve this now," he said, his voice calm, controlled, leaving no room for interruption. Naomi did not speak immediately. She allowed the moment to settle, allowed the room to fully absorb the change that had just taken place. And then she reached slowly for her phone. This time no one stopped her. No one spoke. The silence itself had changed. What had once been restriction was now permission. Her fingers wrapped around the device with the same steady control she had shown from the beginning. And as she lifted it from the table, the younger officer watched closely, his expression no longer uncertain but attentive, aware that this moment carried weight far beyond what he had initially understood. Naomi glanced once more at Daniel, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something that felt closer to finality. And then she looked back to the figure in front of her. "Already know why I am here," she said, her voice even, her tone measured. The figure gave a slight nod. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and that single acknowledgement carried more confirmation than any explanation could have. Daniel's gaze snapped between them, the realization beginning to take shape, not fully formed yet, but no longer avoidable. The pieces aligning in a way that made everything that had happened feel heavier, more consequential. The folder on the table, the call he had made, the command he had ignored, all of it now connected to something larger than he had allowed himself to consider. Naomi's eyes returned to him one last time, and in that look there was no accusation, no need for it. The moment itself had already said everything. The room stood still, the camera continued to record, and Daniel, standing there no longer the center of control, but at the edge of consequence, felt the full weight of the shift settle in, because this was no longer a situation he could manage. It was a situation that had already moved beyond him, and whatever came next would not be shaped by his decisions, but by the truth he had tried to override. The moment Naomi Carter lifted her phone, the room shifted in a way that no one could reverse, not with authority, not with denial, not even with silence. Her movement was slow, deliberate, every second stretching just enough to let the weight of it settle over everyone watching. Daniel Brooks felt it immediately, that quiet certainty that had followed her from the beginning, now taking form in a way he could no longer ignore. His eyes fixed on the device in her hand, his mind racing to catch up with what he had already set in motion. The figure standing in front of her did not interrupt, did not question his, carrying a weight that settled into the room with finality. The figure nearest her nodded once, his posture shifting slightly as he turned toward Daniel. "You will step aside completely," he said, his tone calm but absolute, effective immediately. The second figure moved toward the table, reaching for the folder Daniel had handled earlier, opening it with care, his eyes scanning quickly but thoroughly, this time with the kind of attention that recognized what it was looking at. Daniel took a step back without being told again, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up, the space between him and Naomi widening. But the weight of the moment following him, pressing against his chest, the younger officer stood still, his posture straight, his eyes fixed forward, no longer uncertain, but fully aware that the situation had moved beyond anything he could influence. Naomi lowered her phone to her side. Her hand relaxed. Her presence unchanged, but now fully revealed in a way that no one in the room could ignore. The camera continued to record, the red light steady, capturing the exact moment where control shifted completely, and Daniel, standing there no longer at the center, but at the edge, felt the truth settle in with a clarity he could not escape. This was never his situation to control, and the moment he tried to force it into his own understanding was the moment everything began to shut down around him. The room no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to process, and that difference could be felt in every movement, every glance, every breath. The second figure at the table continued reviewing the folder with focused precision, turning each page slowly, carefully, not skipping a single line, his expression tightening just slightly with each detail confirmed. The first figure remained near Naomi Carter, his posture protective without being aggressive, his presence creating a quiet boundary that no one questioned. Daniel Brooks stood a few steps back now, his hands no longer tense, but not relaxed either, caught somewhere between holding on and letting go. His eyes moved from Naomi to the folder, then to the officers who had entered, trying to piece together the reality that was unfolding in front of him. The younger officer remained still, his stance straight, his silence no longer uncertain, but respectful, aware that this was no longer a situation to observe, but one to witness. The second figure finally closed the folder, his hand resting on it for a brief moment, as if acknowledging the weight of what it contained. Then he looked up, his gaze landing directly on Daniel, steady, measured, leaving no room for interpretation. "This clearance is valid," he said, his voice calm, but carrying authority that filled the room, "and it was never yours to challenge in this manner." The words were not loud, but they struck harder than any raised voice could have. Daniel's throat tightened slightly, the confirmation landing in a way that removed the last piece of doubt he had been holding on to. His eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not anger, not resistance, but realization, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been set in motion. Naomi did not react to the statement. She did not acknowledge it with satisfaction or relief. She simply stood there, her presence unchanged, her calm intact, as if this outcome had never been in question. The first figure turned slightly, addressing the room rather than just one person. "This interaction is now under formal review," he said, each word deliberate, effective immediately. The younger officer nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes lowering slightly in acknowledgement, understanding that the situation had moved beyond immediate consequences into something more permanent. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his voice when it came quieter, more controlled, but carrying an edge of something that sounded like disbelief. "I was following procedure," he said, not as a defense, but as an attempt to hold on to something that still made sense to him. The second figure met his gaze without hesitation. "Procedure does not replace judgment," he replied, his tone even, "and it does not justify escalation without cause." The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, the kind of silence that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the door, then back to the figures in front of her, and she spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority that had defined her from the beginning. "Ensure that every step taken here is documented," she said, not as a request, but as a directive. The first figure nodded immediately. "It already is," he replied, glancing briefly toward the camera in the corner, the red light still steady, still capturing everything. Daniel followed that glance, his eyes landing on the camera for the first time with full awareness of what it meant. Not just a recording device, but a witness, one that did not forget, one that would replay every moment exactly as it happened. The weight of that realization settled heavily, his shoulders lowering slightly, the last trace of resistance giving way to something quieter, something more final. The younger officer took a small step back, giving space as the situation fully transitioned out of their hands. Naomi lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat but in closure, and then lifted it again, her posture as steady as ever. The room no longer felt like a place of confrontation. It felt like a place where consequences had already taken root. And Daniel, standing at the edge of it all, understood in that moment that what had begun as a simple stop had become something far larger, something that would not end when this room emptied, but would follow him long after, because some decisions do not echo loudly in the moment. They echo quietly, over time, in ways that cannot be undone. The shift from control to consequence was no longer subtle. It was visible in every movement that followed. The two officials moved with quiet efficiency, not rushed, not aggressive, but precise, as if every second now carried purpose beyond the room. The second figure reopened the folder briefly, extracting a single document and holding it eye level, verifying one last detail before lowering it again. His attention then moved back to Daniel Brooks. And this time, there was no ambiguity left. In his tone, "Officer Brooks, you're being temporarily relieved of duty pending full review," he said, each word measured, leaving no space for interpretation or negotiation. The statement did not echo. It settled, heavy and final. Daniel did not respond immediately, his body still, his mind catching up to a reality that no longer required his agreement. His eyes moved once more to Naomi Carter, as if searching for something that might still shift the outcome. But she stood exactly as she had. From the beginning, calm, grounded, unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because she had always known how it would. And the younger officer swallowed subtly, his gaze lowering slightly, not out of shame, but out of recognition of the moment, the kind of moment that changes how you see everything that came before it. The first figure stepped forward slightly, his posture firm but not aggressive. "You will surrender your radio and badge," he continued, his voice steady, the words carrying the weight of protocol now fully activated. Daniel's hand moved slowly, almost automatically, unclipping the radio from his shoulder, his fingers lingering on it for just a second longer than necessary before placing it carefully on the table. The sound of it resting against the metal surface was soft, but in the silence of the room it felt louder than anything that had been said. He then reached for his badge, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if maintaining composure was the last thing he could still hold on to. The badge came free, and for a brief moment he looked at it, not with pride, not even with regret, but with a quiet understanding of what it had represented and what it no longer did. He placed it beside the radio, his hand withdrawing slowly. Empty now. The second figure nodded once, acknowledging the action, then turned slightly toward the younger officer. "You will assist with documentation and remain available for statement," he said. The younger officer responded immediately, "Yes, sir," his voice firm, steady, no hesitation left. Naomi watched all of this without movement, her presence steady, her gaze calm, not detached but composed, as if she understood that this moment was not about punishment but about correction, about restoring something that had been pushed out of place. The first figure turned back to her, his posture shifting once more, respectful. "Ma'am, your clearance has been fully confirmed," he said, his tone measured. "You are free to proceed whenever you are ready." Naomi inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, but she did not move right away. Instead, she looked once more at Daniel, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something that felt closer to closure. "This did not have to happen," she said, her voice soft, steady, the words simple, but carrying a weight that reached beyond the room. Daniel did not answer. His gaze lowered slightly, not in defeat but in recognition, the kind that arrives when there is nothing left to argue against. The room remained still for a moment longer, the camera in the corner continuing its silent watch, the red light unwavering, capturing the final pieces of a moment that had shifted from control to consequence. And then Naomi reached for her bag, lifting it with the same calm she had carried from the start, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time itself had never been something she needed to chase. The official stepped aside to give her space. The younger officer moved too, opened the door, and, as it swung open, The sounds of the airport returned, distant announcements, rolling luggage, the steady movement of a world that had continued outside while everything inside this room had changed. Naomi stepped forward, crossing the threshold without looking back, her presence leaving the room, but the impact of it remaining, and behind her Daniel stood still, the weight of what had happened settling fully now, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting, the kind of consequence that does not end when the moment does, but continues long after, in ways that cannot be undone. Naomi Carter did not slow down as she stepped back into the flow of the airport. The world outside the room continuing exactly as it had before, travelers moving with purpose, announcements echoing overhead, the rhythm of departures and arrivals untouched by what had just unfolded behind closed doors, and yet something had changed, not in the space itself, but in the balance of it, in the quiet correction that had taken place without noise, without spectacle. She walked toward her gate with steady steps, her carry-on rolling softly behind her, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the moment she had just left behind was not something to carry, but something already resolved. Behind her the door to the screening room closed, and with it the last illusion of control that had once defined it. Inside, Daniel Brooks remained standing where she had left him, the absence of his badge and radio more noticeable with each passing second, not because of what they were, but because of what they had allowed him to believe. The room felt different now, quieter, not in sound but in meaning. The officials moved with quiet efficiency, gathering documents, confirming records, speaking in low voices that did not need to rise to be understood. The younger officer followed instructions. Carefully, his movements precise, his attention focused, no longer uncertain, but fully aware of the weight of what he had witnessed. Daniel's gaze lingered on the table where his badge had rested just moments ago, the imprint of that absence settling deeper than anything spoken. His mind replayed the sequence again and again. The stop, the decision, the call, the command he chose to ignore. Each moment clear now in a way it had not been before. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, until it could no longer be avoided outside. Naomi reached her gate just as boarding began, the line moving steadily, passengers presenting their passes, stepping forward without hesitation. She joined them without drawing attention, without needing to. Her place there no longer questioned, not by anyone who understood what had already been confirmed. When she handed over her boarding pass, the agent glanced at it, then at her, offering a small nod, professional, respectful, nothing more, nothing less. And Naomi returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement she had carried from the beginning. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the sound of the terminal fading behind her, replaced by the low hum of the aircraft waiting ahead. Inside the screening room, the final steps of the process continued, documentation secured, statements noted, timelines recorded, not rushed, not delayed, but completed with the same precision that had been missing at the start. Daniel was escorted from the room, not forcefully, not publicly, but firmly, the kind of movement that did not require resistance because it left no room for it. As he stepped into the corridor, the familiar sounds of the airport returned, but they no longer felt the same, not because they had changed, but because he now stood outside of the control he had once assumed was his. The officials remained behind, ensuring that everything was accounted for, that nothing was overlooked, that the moment would not be forgotten or rewritten, and above it all, the camera in the corner had captured everything, every word, every decision, every second where the truth had been ignored and then restored. And somewhere above the terminal, the aircraft carrying Naomi Carter lifted into the sky, its ascent smooth, uninterrupted, leaving behind a space that had been quietly corrected, not by force, not by volume, but by something far more powerful, the simple, undeniable weight of truth. And in the stillness that followed, one reality remained. He thought he controlled the system, but that day, the system answered to someone else.